Welcome to today's Explainer. We are about to embark on a massive journey through American political history to answer one burning question. Why is our trust in institutions so deeply fractured today? We're going to track this from the very first political parties through sweeping 20th century economic shifts all the way to our modern crisis of confidence.
All right, to figure this out, we're actually going to start with a literal university syllabus. This is from John French's POS 190 class, The Scope of Political Science. It perfectly defines politics as the process of making binding group decisions. Sounds straightforward, right? But as the syllabus warns, in practice, it becomes incredibly complicated, involving dense institutions and messy debates about who even belongs to the community in the first place.
Consider this our roadmap for the Explainer today. We'll cover the scope of politics, America's first-party system, the neoliberal political order, our current era of fractured trust, and finally, how to restore our institutions. Let's dive into Section 1, the scope of politics, understanding the academic foundation. So, look at how this Paul's 190 syllabus takes the absolute chaos of human governance and breaks it down into three core categories: law and institutions, markets and power, and culture and identity. We're going to use these exact three lenses today to diagnose how America's political system arrived at its current, kind of fractured state.
Moving right along to Section 2, America's first party system, law and institutions.
This right here perfectly illustrates our initial institutional fracture. You see, the Constitution's framers actually hated the idea of political parties. But, surprise, surprise, almost immediately two factions emerged anyway. On one side, we had Alexander Hamilton's Federalists. They appealed to Northern business and wanted a super powerful federal government. And on the flip side, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. They were rooted in the South, demanded a strict limit on federal power, and interestingly, favored France over Britain. Looking at the numbers, you can clearly track this dramatic shift in congressional power. The Federalists started out really strong, grabbing 57% of the House back in 1788. But the Democratic Republicans, well, they innovated. They used local voter coordination and partisan newspapers to completely turn the tide. And this whole thing culminated in Jefferson's sweeping 1800 victory, capturing a whopping 63% of the House and pushing the Federalists into a permanent minority. The reality of this shift is captured perfectly in a 1798 quote from Jefferson himself. He notes, "Two political sects have arisen. Federalists, the latter are styled Republicans." The idea that a nation literally needed two rival parties wasn't universally accepted just yet. But the institutional reality? Yeah, it was already completely locked in. All right, Section 3, the neoliberal political order, markets and power. Let's see how this builds over time. Historian Gary Gerstle argues that American politics over the last 80 years has really been defined by distinct political orders. It goes like this. The New Deal order dominated until the 1970s. Then the neoliberal order rose under Ronald Reagan, became the absolute bipartisan consensus under Bill Clinton in the 90s, and finally and violently fractured during the 2008 Great Recession. To really grasp this, we have to understand what a political order actually does. Gerstle argues that when a political order reigns supreme, like neoliberalism did throughout the 80s and 90s, it successfully convinces the public that its specific economic principles are, well, just common sense. It universalizes its ideology so thoroughly that any alternative ways of organizing markets and power are viewed by the mainstream as totally unworkable, basically a pipe dream. But when an order fractures, like it did in 2008, it leaves behind a massive vacuum. Which brings us to Section 4, polarization and fractured trust. Culture and identity. Based on some incredibly extensive research from the academic journal Daedalus, we can see how institutional trust has entirely polarized along partisan lines over the last 50 years. It's a stark divide. Republicans show really high confidence in the military, police, religion, and business. Meanwhile, Democrats, they trust totally different spheres like science, the media, higher education, and labor. We aren't just disagreeing on policy anymore, folks. We're fundamentally disagreeing on reality. The researchers point out that this massive divide stems from distinct ideological roots. As Daedalus notes, conservative skepticism is heavily driven by a decades-long backlash against government market regulation. And that sentiment grew during the neoliberal era, eventually morphing into broader anti-government and occasionally anti-science attitudes. On the flip side, Democrats have sustained a really high faith in formal, expert-led institutions. This dynamic became glaringly visible during the differing partisan responses to public health guidelines during the COVID-19 pandemic. But wait, is it just politics? Well, beyond pure partisanship, Sociologists point to some massive structural forces driving this 50-year declining confidence. People are deeply dissatisfied with government accountability. Throw in rising income inequality, deep societal segregation, an immediate ecosystem that's absolutely plagued by disinformation, and honestly, it's no wonder the shared reality necessary for a community to function has eroded so badly.
And this brilliantly connects right back to our original course syllabus. Remember how it linked markets in power directly with culture and identity? Well, here we see exactly why. Shifts in economic power, like the rise and fall of the neoliberal order and all that resulting income inequality, directly fuel the cultural resentment, the polarization, and the total loss of trust we see tearing at the fabric of society today. Everything is completely connected.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, Restoring Our Institutions, the Path Forward.
I really want to highlight this powerful insight from political scientist Margaret Levy. She emphasizes that trust isn't just something the public blindly gives away. It has to be earned through tangible, effective leadership. You literally cannot simply demand that people trust the media or trust the government. The institutions themselves have to step up and demonstrate baseline competence.
So how do we achieve that competence? Well, researchers propose some very concrete steps. They argue for highly inclusive policymaking that actually listens to dissenting and minority voices. They point to reforms like citizen oversight boards to help police regain community faith. And crucially, they call for expert humility, suggesting that the absolute best way to rebuild trust might actually be through empowering local leaders, rather than relying on distant federal bureaucracies. So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. We've seen how factions have existed since the very birth of the nation, and how shifting economic orders can leave communities behind and completely fracture our trust. As we navigate the legacy of these massive systems, what is your responsibility to our expanded American community of fate? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and remember to keep asking the tough questions.